Die Diaspora spricht.
Parlando.
Diaspora
Conoscere.
Falando.
Diaspora sta de parler.
Diaspora spricht.
Diasporas speaking.
My name is Rina Limoni, and I'm the host of Diasporas Speaking. In this podcast, together with our guests, we will explore the journeys, activism, and academic developments concerning Kosovo, Albanian, and Balkan diasporas to attain a deeper understanding of our communities scattered around the globe. In the first part of this episode, I will speak to Bled Berisha, among others, about her work as an executive manager of the umbrella organization of women's shelters in Switzerland and Liechtenstein, to understand how migrant women are affected by the intersection of racism and sexism. In the second part, I will speak to Nora about her recent column in the digital magazine TSRICH, where she calls for a nuanced view and intersectional approach to feminist work, shying away from totalizing language. Guten Morgen, Bliata. Mirë se erdhe te Diaspora Speaking.
Mirëmëngjesi, Rina. Thank you for having me.
We usually start the conversation with these questions. Where are you from in Kosovo? Where did you grow up in Switzerland? And what do you do in your day-to-day?
I am from Dobrdal in Kosovo, which is a very, very small village next to Klina. And when you go from Pristina to Peja, it's somewhere in between there. And I was born in Pristina. Then in Switzerland, when we arrived, that was end of 1991, we first arrived to Lucerne, which is more or less in the middle of Switzerland, with a huge lake and lots of mountains and lots of concrete. That was what I was thinking the first when I arrived there as a child. And what I do day to day now, especially, is that I work for the umbrella organization of the women's shelters of Switzerland and Liechtenstein. Is like an association that is doing advocacy for the interests of women's shelters. And we have 24 members, which are the women's shelters. We advocate for the interest of our members on a national level, focusing on quality assurance, collaboration, and sharing best practices among shelters, and also to raise public awareness about domestic violence. We try to influence public policy to improve also legal frameworks and secure resources for victim support.
You touched on your work. You are currently the executive manager of the umbrella organization of women's shelters in Switzerland and Liechtenstein. In your bio, you mention how forms of violence were part of your life. What does it feel like to employ this position with this history and as a woman with a migrant background, especially also because a position like this, I imagine, is often attributed to members of the dominant society mainly?
In my biography, I mentioned that I have also had various forms of violence, but I think every woman or person that is socialized as a female in our world has experienced some forms of violence, gender-based violence. That's why I think it's important to say that also, especially as a migrant woman, like a person that is migrated from another country to a host country, and especially from a country like from the global south, or in my case from the Balkans, place that is very stigmatized and has a specific discrimination in Switzerland. I think it's important to have persons with this positionality as an executive manager or director, because I think I bring a specific view also on the issue of violence. Being a migrant person, I think somehow automatically brings or makes you experience violence, because we live in an unjust world and the legal framework in Switzerland is not welcoming people that are migrating. And it was also then when I arrived from Kosovo to Switzerland the case. So I think for me to work there is important to somehow have representing also this part of the population of Switzerland, which is actually 25% of the Swiss population are people that don't have a Swiss passport, which is a lot. So 25% cannot vote in Switzerland for their issues, and the government in Switzerland is very right wing. That means that there is about 30% of voting, 30% from the population.
Mm-hmm.
So it's such a minority that makes rules for another minority, which is very dangerous, I think. That's why I think it's important that people like me are in this kind of positions. I also think that women in women's shelters, I was also working very often, like for 5 years within the shelter, like at the basis. And there I often had experienced the exchange with Albanian women that were there as clients, saying like, oh, it's so important, or it's very nice that you are here because first we can speak the language and you understand me a bit differently. That was mostly what they were giving me as feedback. I think also my team, my colleagues from the Swiss people, they realized that it makes a difference if when I was working there or not.
Right-wing extremism tends to change political discourse at every level and influences every part of society. So as such, there is an ongoing discourse about how migrant men are being portrayed as more prone to violence, and how, as a consequence, migrant women in Switzerland are more prone to seek help in shelters. What is being missed in this debate?
The very important thing to mention, like I said before, Switzerland has a strong right-wing or right extremist party, which is the SVP, Schweizerische Volkspartei, like the Swiss Popular Party, that has had a huge influence also on the immigration policy concerning, like they make a deportation initiative that, for example, people that have no Swiss passport but a legal status without having a Swiss passport, they could face, or they can face, deportation if they do several criminal acts. If they behave criminal, they can be deported also after having a legal status, which is quite specific to Switzerland, and it's very dangerous to have this kind of rules. Also because, for example, to make the bridge to my work, a woman from Kosovo that just recently arrived in Switzerland because she's marrying an Albanian that is already living in Switzerland, that has legal status, she will experience violence within that relationship. And then she has to ask herself, do I want to call the police, or who should I call, or what do I want to do? Because I will risk being deported, or my partner will risk to be deported, although he's the perpetrator. This woman will have to think about it properly because maybe they have children together and she doesn't want to be in this abusive relationship anymore, but she doesn't want to lose the father of the children. Yeah, so there is a lot more questions that a migrant woman has to make for herself. And this means that these are a lot more obstacles for her to choose to take a step against this violent relationship. And also what this right-wing party is making, or this discussion in general in Swiss society and media, is that Albanian men are aggressive, like backwarded, and very patriarchal. It is interesting because somehow they say patriarchy is in the Balkans and not in Switzerland, which is also dangerous for all the women or female socialized people in Switzerland to say that patriarchy is imported. If you say patriarchy comes from another country and not from where you are, it doesn't make sense because patriarchy is global, it's worldwide, and it's in every region, in every small town, everywhere. And this is something that makes also the discussion about violence, it simplifies it, and it's very problematic because it's important to have a detailed view on violence, especially for migrant women.
You're saying the discussion is simplified, and this draws us to data because often the members of society who consume these discourses tend to draw to the available open source data, if I can call them so, in these articles, which are not complete and allude that the data is saying migrant men are more violent because even a famous self-proclaimed feminist from Kosovo is saying that. And as a data analyst myself, working with data every day, I understand how data can be manipulated and portrayed in ways that are subject to the parameters one chooses, meaning the interpretation then is subject to the eye and material reality of the beholder. So the question is, how can data be used to disrupt rather than enforce existing hierarchies?
I think what is important is to ask the right questions or ask more specific questions concerning violence, especially domestic violence. What is happening now with the data in Switzerland is that actually, I have to say it first, that there is no national database to track domestic violence cases. So this is leading to a lack of comprehensive standardized data. And this is a problem, that this is not really existing. The only data we have from the women's shelter, for example, from the umbrella organization, is we are actually the only ones that have these data. And then there is also the police crime data, which is very important to know that these are only the cases that are reported and only represents the work that the police does, which doesn't mean that this is what is actually happening in the society concerning domestic violence. I personally think that these data from the police criminal statistics, they are over-interpreted. They are taken as a measure of representing the whole society, which is not true, because there are so many people that first don't report their cases to the police because they fear, for example, as I mentioned before, they fear being deported, that their legal status will change. Although there were some new laws implemented that is good for migrant women, because now from the next year on, it will be easier for migrant women with a not regulated status to go to have a help they needed without fearing to lose their legal status, which is progress, a small step, but in a good direction. But we were talking about data. I think it's important to improve this collection of data, is that experience of a migrant woman, here in this case of a woman from Kosovo or from Northern Macedonia or Albania, like an Albanian woman, or they are being racialized in Switzerland, and therefore we need to adopt this perspective that takes into account the intersection of, like, let's say, race and gender. This has also to be reflected in the collection of data. And like this intersection of, for example, race and gender or class also, because this specific experience is shaped by gender oppression and racial marginalization and classism, for example. Most of the data, they just take one aspect and not the whole picture. This is problematic because this is like food for right-wing parties, or for this can lead to misunderstanding the whole experience of violence, because being racialized is also violent. Gender oppression is also violence, and not only the aspect of then within your partnership. I mean, this is also for sure violence, and it's just important to think this specific situation that makes it more complex. And I think the complexity of experiences of, for example, a migrant woman is not well represented in this data collection, I think. And that's why, as I said before, I think it's important to ask the right questions. It's not enough to just ask the nationality, but it's also important to ask, for example, like, how much do you earn, or do you have specific work, and when did you arrive in Switzerland, or what made you struggle when you arrived in Switzerland, and what are your fears, or I don't know. It should be more complex also, the collection of data.
What advice do you give when reporting the data to other organizations or state structures and institutions?
We, for example, collect also the nationality of our clients. It's also that the state asks us to do. This, for example, we always, if we say in our yearly reports, if we say most of the clients are migrant women, we at the same time say that this is due to their conditions they live in. For example, the condition that, as I mentioned, the legal framework or the socio-economic factor where they live in, or maybe they just arrived in Switzerland, so that means that they are not very well connected to a community or to friendship, and it's more difficult for them to find out where to go. Maybe they cannot just go to a friend to sleep over when they are experiencing violence. And we always try to explain, for example, a white Swiss woman, probably she is well connected, she has friends, and probably she is also knows where to ask for help and knows her rights. So it is a different situation that make white Swiss women, for example, to find their own solutions to leave this abusive relationship, where, for example, the Albanian migrant woman that just arrived in Switzerland has more difficulties to find herself or to find for herself help, and because she is maybe isolated and has maybe not learned the language of her region. So I think for us it's important, if we say that this and this nationality is mostly represented in the women's shelters, that we say at the same time we have to consider the immigration policy in Switzerland. We have to consider the conditions where our clients find themselves. Concerning data collection, I think it's also important to think about how you use the data, because this is something that depends on also your own political motivation. So therefore, I think it's important that our role from the women's shelters, the umbrella organization, is also to sensibilize people about patriarchy, gender-based violence, and, as I mentioned, the intersection of racism, classism. I think how you interpret data depends also on your way of thinking somehow, or how were shaped, and that's why I think it's important to think about how you interpret the data also. I mean, you can collect whatever you want, but then, yeah, I think it's important to also reflect on yourself if you see any data anywhere, any statistics.
And it is very important that you underline positionality here. I came across this research from women's shelters in Berlin, particularly, where activists and feminists had particular views on what women needed, but only by working with victims of domestic violence did they change their views, because women who were living in the shelters had different visions on circumventing violent situations and how to change their situations. And this co-working led to better understanding. So it is very important, as you are underlining, to consider positionalities and how this affects the interpretation of data. And as we are drawing closer to the end of this conversation, what advice would you give to feminist practitioners or those who are seeking a better understanding of the different discourses and women's positionalities generally, well understanding that it is difficult to generalize, but is there anything you would like to say in this regard?
I think the fight for gender equality cannot be separated from the fight against racism and injustice, or like migrant women, especially those from the global south or other marginalized ethnic groups, face their specific challenges that differ from those of white Swiss women. That's why I think that we need an inclusive feminism, intersectional feminism, that addresses the needs of migrant women, recognizing that their struggles are not just about gender, but, as I said before, about race, class, and this immigration status. And I think only by embracing this intersectional approach, we can develop effective strategies to combat violence, gender-based discrimination. Albanian women in Switzerland are often stereotyped as submissive or trapped in a conservative, patriarchal family structures. this portrayal is very simplistic, and in yours the agency and the resilience of many, many, many migrant women, as well it in yours also the diversity within the Albanian diaspora. And therefore, I think it's very important how we speak about Albanian women or Albanian community in Switzerland. It is also a diverse group because Albanians can also be rich, they can also be queer people, lesbians, gays, and it's so important to talk about all these different aspects within Albanian community and to deconstruct also these stereotypes, which also means that there is no the Albanian woman or the victim. Every person has an own positionality. I mean, there are a lot of structures, oppressive structures that somehow make everybody feel them or in a different way. Therefore, I think it's important also for the Albanian communities to recognize the diversity within the community, and also for, let's say the dominant society in Switzerland to recognize that. I think it goes in both ways, like within the community. I'm just saying it as something that it is actually not homogenic group. It is very heterogenic. And the same is also concerning domestic violence, and therefore the help for a person or female socialized person has to be also specialized.
Faleminderit shumë, Bleta, for accepting my invitation for this bonus episode and for agreeing to record on such short notice. I think it is very important to have a nuanced conversation on the subject of domestic violence in Switzerland, in Germany, or anywhere else in the diaspora.
Thank you very much, Irina. Thank you for asking such good questions. It's very important.
Welcome to Diaspora Speaking, Nora.
Hello.
Thank you so much for accepting my invitation on such a short notice and for sharing your views on the latest media portrayals of Albanian women in Switzerland. For our audience, where are you from? Where did you grow up? And what do you do in your day-to-day?
Right now I'm in Zurich. This is the place I was born and raised. And my parents came from a small town called Struga. It's by the Ohrid Lake, a very beautiful place. So basically I'm from Zurich and from Strug. I'm right now a lecturer for future teachers in primary schools. I'm also doing my PhD at the University of Zurich. I'm a mom of two. I have two kids, and I love reading, the piano, coffee, and fashion.
Recently in Switzerland, there has been, I would say, an uproar, a certain portraitization of Albanian culture, of Albanian women and men in the media. And as a consequence, you wrote a column criticizing a particular column in this regard, which was written in the Tagesanzeiger titled Albanian or Kosovo Women, We Need to Defend Ourselves. What drew you to writing this column? Where would you say you agree with what was written in the Tagesanzeiger? And where would you rather say, well, I see it in a different light?
Well, the magazine where the article was in, I usually read it on Sundays. It's a specific magazine of the Tagesanzeiger. So it's once a week that I get that magazine. And then a friend of mine, Friday evening, she texted me. She told me, have you seen this? You have to read it. And she was very, very angry. And I didn't want to read it, but then I saw the title and it was very catchy. So I had to read it. At first, I could understand her anger, but then I was very careful of how to respond because I thought, okay, well, this article, it's not that wrong. So, but I get where she came from, her anger. She texted me that she's so sick of this whole narrative of Albanian women being oppressed, or this picture of an Albanian woman in Switzerland being oppressed. And she's just sick and tired of it. And I get where she comes from. I read the article then the next day again, and then I realized, or I read it carefully, and I immediately saw what I agree with and what I don't. So basically, I mean, what is in the article about the abuse and about the oppression of Albanian women, I think we don't have to discuss that here and ask ourselves if it's true or not. Obviously, it is true. Albanian women are under oppression and we are fighting for equality. So that's not even what bothers me. And even the stories that are in the article that are very, very horrible and a piece of reality are very important to tell. It's important that those stories are told. That's not the part that bothers me. What bothered me was that the whole context was missing. So it was a story of the Albanian woman in Switzerland being oppressed. And I think that's what also triggered my friend who read that text, and also many other women, obviously. And that is the whole part that bothers me. So there is no context on the whole story of equality for women in general. That bothered me the most. Because, you know, it's hard to say that there's that one Albanian woman in general anyway. So generalization is hard anyways. And we still try to categorize and we still try to understand what happens here. But then the context of women being abused and women being oppressed in general, that was the whole point that was missing. And it bothers me because, as you can see then in the comments of the article online, most of the comments are racist comments that do not talk about abuse or oppression and equality, but they're talking about being Albanian and how Albanians don't treat their women right and how Albanian women are oppressed. So that was basically the whole issue I had with the text.
What you're saying is that the article fails to describe the how and contextualize, falling short of theorization specifically, and how this fits within global patriarchy more generally. Do you think that is intentional?
You have to understand when you write, I mean, when you write for people that should be reading your article, of course, there's some intention. Even like I said, it's catchy, you know? So I don't think that it's intentional to just leave it all out, the context, and especially the part about the patriarchy. So I don't think that's intentional, but I do think that some things are intentional so the reader reads it, you know, even the title. So that's the other point that I ask myself. Who do you talk to? Who do you write to? I mean, the text is written for basically a Swiss speaking people, and not really for Albanians, because I would, and that's now my opinion, I would think that not that many read that magazine. So it is intentional how you write it and who you write it to. And that's also, again, to the context. If you talk to Swiss people, you have to give them the context and you have to explain we are looking at an Albanian problem that is part of a global problem. We are looking at oppression of Albanian women that are going back to oppression of women in general, also Swiss women. So I wouldn't say that it was intentionally to harm, but I guess it was intentionally to catch the audience.
And that does not necessarily help migrant women who are in a situation of violence in Switzerland, because then an underlying factor could be, when I report violence, how will I be framed? Along what lines and what racialization will I have to undergo in this regard? So women are placed in a conundrum between racism and sexism. So there is I would say, a willful misunderstanding here that has a history in Swiss media, history of representation of Albanians, because the public landscape in Switzerland recovers Albanians between good and bad Albanians. And in your column, show how patriarchy is not only an Albanian problem, but for you personally, how is your positionality affected by such discourses?
Well, first of all, I have to explain myself, especially to my Swiss friends, and even though they are very open-minded and they're very aware of this whole subject of equality between women and men, they still get that feeling that this is the picture of the Albanian woman. And when I read also, I mean, let's start there. That shows how intersectional this whole subject is. It's very complex. Like if you talk about a woman from North Macedonia that is in Switzerland and has had that awful story, you have that picture of that woman. So, and that's very special about Albanians. We are from Albania, we are from North Macedonia, we are from Kosovo, parts of us from Montenegro, and then not to forget the diaspora. So it affects us because we are so the same in one way, but so different. And that is, again, what affects me too. And it's missing for me. So the context of, are you from this part of the Albanian speaking parts, or are you from that part? Are you from the city? Are you from the village? Are you from Zurich? Are you from St. Gallen? Are you from Zurich city? Are you from a village here? You know, it's very, very complex. Like it's very complex, and it affects me and other women because we have to explain ourselves again. And that's what I tried with my article to tell again. It's not that easy. It's very intersectional. Intersectionality is something that we tend to forget here. And it's not just about being Albanian or not. It's about being from the village, from the city. It's about class. Obviously, what we understand under class. Are you from a background that has done university or is working, or, you know, it's so complex. Like we would need a whole day to talk about this. But it affects, in the end, it affects me a lot because I have to explain myself. And that's the part that makes it very hard, because I have to start from zero to explain. I cannot explain, especially not to my Swiss friends. I have to start from zero and tell them, look, we obviously do have problems in Albanian culture or Albanian speaking cultures, but it is a global problem. It is something that Swiss people have too. We have every 2 weeks, a woman is being killed by her partner, her husband, by a male, especially male. I want to talk about this. In the first place, it's always a male, it's a man. And then we can look at what kind of men, what kind of culture, what kind of job. But that doesn't really matter in the fact that it was a woman killed by a man. And I have to remind my Swiss people about that. I have to remind them that even in Switzerland, compared to other European countries, I mean, if we compare Switzerland to Sweden, my Swedish family laughs at us when we tell them that we didn't have paternity leave after birth until 3 years ago. When my daughter was born, my husband, it was the year that the elections were, and we voted for 2 weeks paternity leave for fathers in Switzerland. And in other countries, they laugh about it. So we Swiss people, are the ones that are oppressing their women or don't have equality because we are so behind with some subjects. So you see, it's really, really complex.
You're saying we, which means you are part of the Swiss society. You were born in Switzerland and you view yourself as a Swiss person as much as you view yourself as an Albanian person. And in these discourses, this gets lost. It makes you choose in a way, because when you go to work, you're asked, what is going on in your Albanian culture? As if you are a representative and appointee of millions of people, which is problematic because a group definition has been attributed. And also considering that in comparison to other Western European states, Switzerland only sometimes in the 1970s granted women the right to vote, means that patriarchy is very much part of the society as it is part of the Albanian society, perhaps with different histories. You touched on this point, but to conclude this conversation, what do you think are the consequences for the Albanian community in Switzerland at large, where such discourses are kept alive in the media continuously?
You're talking about things on an Albanian level, let's say. Like you said, when I go to work and my colleagues ask what's happening with Albanian women, I have to stick to that narrative and talk about being Albanian. And what gets forgotten is being a woman then in this narrative. And so every time we talk about things that are in the media, the first thing they talk about is why Albanians, how do Albanians do it? You see Albanians do it that way. And the whole bigger context is missing. And that's what bothered me. Again, I have to say, in this whole narrative, it bothers me that I have to explain myself in the first place as an Albanian woman instead of as a woman, and talk on that level, you know? So the consequences, you have to always explain yourself for being an Albanian, which is very confusing, because as you said, you are part of that group, of the Albanian speaking group, and then you're part of the Swiss group, because obviously I was born and raised here, so that gets very confusing. And then again, the whole main subject gets lost. So I have to explain what being Albanian means instead of talking about a global problem we're having. We're having a problem of equality. So, and I want to fight that problem. I want to fight in general and make myself clear. I'm a woman and I belong to that group that does not have equality on this world. And I want that on every level, not just on the Albanian level. I don't want to be respected only in my family or known in my family for the loud one who still gets upset when we talk about having sons, who still gets upset when we talk about what a noose is supposed to be. I don't want to do that, and I don't want to be reduced to that. I want the bigger picture. I want to be that Albanian Swiss woman who talks about this in general. And that's what the consequence is. That part gets lost, and we get stuck on the idea of being Albanians, Swiss, and Albanians do it that way, and Swiss do it that way, and which ways were. And then you start to compare, of course. So another consequence is you compare it, and then you think, oh, look at the problems Albanian women have. That's so much worse. Even I catch myself doing that, and then I have to stop myself and say, no, it's not about that. It's not about comparing. Is it worse now to be asked by my colleagues where my kids are when they obviously know they have a father? Or is it worse that I have to, I don't know, be a nuse in my Albanian household? I don't want to compare it like that. I wanted to have a bigger picture and see the problem, the main problem,
which is patriarchy. And unfortunately, this gets lost. And I think it is important that you used your voice to show more nuance in this regard, rather than write a column demonizing an entire culture which does not directly help Albanian women, perhaps, or does not change their material reality directly.
Or at least if you do say that, put it in the context that it is,
exactly.
You know, it's bad in the Albanian context because we have certain problems when it comes to patriarchy, but then put it in the context, but it's bad for every woman out there. So it's just a question of how bad is it and in what way is it bad, and not a question of is it bad at all? We know it's bad for women. We know it's hard for us. We have to fight in every corner. And that is the main message that was missing. You have to tell, especially when you write to a Swiss audience. Like I said, obviously this magazine is read by Swiss people mainly, especially when you know your audience and then talk about it in that way. So you have to make clear, yes, we have those problems in Albanian culture or cultures, because it's not one culture, by the way, in one Albanian culture, but it's a continuous fight we have to fight, and not just we women, but also men. So that's what makes it so complex, and that's what bothers me, again, when you talk to your audience that way. And I want to make very clear that in this article, the problems we talk about, these are very real, and there are fights we are fighting, but there are fights we're fighting everywhere. It's just a matter of a different way we're fighting them.
That's a very thoughtful ending to this conversation, because it is very important to underline that this is not a problem particular to Albanian culture, even though it has its own history within our culture. So, Nora, thank you so much for taking the time to record this conversation and share your views with the audience of Diaspora Speaking.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was a pleasure.